Welcome to our next video in 3D content creation for Replicate. In this video, we'll be going over some of the specifics of getting our animations from 3D Max into the Replicate equipment previewer. So let's get started.
So for this video, I'll go ahead and open up the screwdriver scene here. You should have access to these assets by downloading it from the link below. And before we get started, I want you to remember that the final output for this is going to be for the Replicate editor. So most of the concerns like frames per second and timing for your animation won't be applied here within 3D Max at this point. All we're interested in is basically showing the full range of motion from 0 to 100 on our objects, and the timing will be specified later when we specify that behavior within the Replicate editor. So for more information on that, go ahead and watch the Replicate behaviors video, and we'll also link to that so that you can see the other side of that. But for now, we'll go ahead and talk more specifically about animations within 3D Studio Max. So 3D Studio Max uses a special object class known as animation controllers to manage their animation data. And you'll notice that when you create a geometry object, it's got some default controllers applied to it already. So we'll go ahead and open up the schematic view here and show controllers. You can view them by showing the category within the schematic view here. You can see that we've got a position XYZ controller, a Euler rotation controller, and a Bezier scale controller. And these two have individual animation controllers for each specific axis. Now you can see these default controllers as well by going to the Motion tab and looking at the controllers here. And finally, you can open up the curve editor and locate our animation controllers for our specific object here. So you'll also notice that position, rotation, and scale are all grouped under the transform property here. And when we make keys using auto key, maybe uninstalling this object, you'll see the keys appearing in the curve editor. We're actually making transform adjustments to the object. And these are the types of animations that are sampled for our basic animation type when we bring it over to the Replicate editor. Now 3D Max allows you to key pretty much anything with a slider. So let's go ahead and create a box here. So let's say the height of a box, perhaps we can key that. And we can see that that value is changing over time. And you'll notice that if we look at the curve editor and click on transform, that there is no keys located here to represent that type of motion. And that's because these are animations that don't quite apply to an object's transform. But they have their own animation controllers applied to them. So the way that we can get animations like this out from 3D Studio Max to the Replicate editor is by flattening this to a Morpher Modifier. And if you've never worked with the Morpher Modifier, I'll go ahead and take you through that process. Also note that since Replicate's main purpose is helping to achieve maintenance training, your scale keys generally won't be carried over as well. Those will be thrown out. The reasoning is that it didn't make much sense to have dynamically scaling mechanical parts. But if the need arises, again, that sort of scaling type animation can be achieved by flattening it within a Morpher modifier. So let's go ahead and try to point out one of the weaknesses of the default animation controller here. I'll go ahead and unhide this, these settings. Oops. So we've already put an animation here on the screw unscrewing, and it works out pretty well as we're unscrewing the or uninstalling this screw. So let's try it on maybe an angled surface. So we'll go ahead and use a local pivot. Got auto key on and at frame 100. And we'll uninstall it. And when we play back the animation, you'll notice that it certainly doesn't behave like we would expect that type of object to behave in real life. And that's because the default animation controller behaves pretty well when rotating around local axes, but only on the cardinal axes like positive and negative Z, positive and negative Y, and positive and negative X. But it doesn't handle local axes like this very well. So what we'll generally do here to solve this problem is you'll need to utilize Max's alternate controllers. And we'll go ahead and copy that and clear the animation off of it. And we'll assign a different controller on it. And you'll notice that there's several different animation controllers to choose from. Most of these controllers will be sampled when bringing over to the Replicate editor. But we'll go ahead and concentrate on the linear rotation here. So we'll switch that out, switch back to local, and try reanimating here. All right, and we see that it behaves a lot more like it would in real life. So switching animation controllers is a pretty common operation that you'll run into. One final note is that there are controllers called list controllers, and what these are multi-layered controllers that you can use to mix animations within 3D Studio Max. But due to that multi-layered nature, these types of controllers aren't transferable over to Replicate. So our second type of animation is what we'll use to achieve soft deformation, and we'll use the Morpher Modifier to do that. So I'll go ahead and take you through that. We'll start off with a cylinder for simplicity's sake. And we'll boost the height segments so that we can get a decent deformation. And we'll go ahead and use the bend modifier. We'll go ahead and create an animation from 180 to negative 180. And so this will be the animation that that we'll want to flatten into a Morpher modifier. So we'll go ahead and copy that for easier viewing purposes. And we won't want to remove the animation, we'll just collapse it. So this will be our first keyframe, and we'll go ahead and use the Morpher modifier, which can be found in your modifier list here. Now the Morpher modifier is used to mix multiple channels of animation within 3D Studio Max, but when transferring over to Replicate, only this first channel will be exported, and you can pick the morph targets by selecting them from the scene here. And if you've never worked with a Morpher Modifier, you should know that your morph targets should have the exact same number of vertices as your initial object. And the easiest way to make sure that we've got that is we'll use the Snapshot Tool within 3D Studio Max. So we'll click on our object who's got an animation described by a morpher or some other method. And we'll go ahead and click on the Snapshot Tool. We'll move from single over to range. So over the life of our animation, we're going to want to make 10 mesh copies. So we'll go ahead and do that. And we can see the multiple copies of our object have been created. We'll go ahead and move our previous animation over. So from here we'll want to go ahead and load our morph targets within the progressive morph target list. So we'll go ahead and start doing that. Now, one limit to the progressive morph modifier here is that Max has an internal limit of 24 different morph targets that you can load within a progressive morph target list. So that basically means that for deformation purposes in Replicate, your animations are limited to 24 keyframes. So when you're making snapshots, don't go over 24 as you'll run into that inherent max limit. So the final thing that we want to do to prepare this for Replicate is to animate its phase from 0 to 100. Oh, sorry. Advance the frames. And we can see that we've got a little bit slower and faster translation here than our initial animation. And that's due to the fact that our default in-out tangents are ease in, ease out. So for best approximation of what we've got here, you'll want to either set your default keys to a linear keyframe, and you can also fix the other animations by going into the curve editor and making those a linear tangent. And we should have a pretty good approximation of our animation that we've created there now. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at that in Replicate. And this time we're going to use the animation preview mode. And here we can see the objects that we've got animated. We can preview their animation just by clicking on them. You can see the problematic animation with the Euler rotation and the correct one with the linear rotation. And we can preview our morpher animation as well. So I want to note that the default behavior within the Replicate Equipment Previewer is going to be playing these animations over the course of 2 seconds. And of course, that timing information is editable within the Replicate editor. So if you'd like to learn more about setting up those behaviors, go ahead and check out the Replicate behavior video. That'll be linked below for you.
All right, if you've still got any more in-depth questions, feel free to email support@disty.com. In our next video, we'll be examining the animation isolator included with the Replicate exporter and how to use that in 3D Studio Max.